Well, hello and welcome back. Yesterday evening we looked at the process of stretching paper, why it's important, and we went through the process of doing that. So today we're going to move to the next step, and that is sketching our scene. Now I have our stretcher board here, and as you can see it's all nice and flat. Yesterday when we had it all wet and were taping it down, you probably noticed there was some waviness in the paper. But after drying all night, now you can see that it's nice and flat. And in fact, in the center of this paper now, it's off the plywood maybe about 1/4 of an inch. So it's really like, it's like a drum. So no matter how much water we put on this painting from now on, it will just stay completely flat. And this is going to be important when it comes to the finished product, because when it's time to frame it, it will be just nice and neat and ready to go in the frame. So we got our paper stretched, and so the next step now is taking our photo and transferring that scene to the paper. Now remember, we're not copying a photograph. We're making a painting from a photograph, but because it's going to be a detailed watercolor painting, we need to really sketch out our scene before we start painting. If you're painting with acrylic or maybe oils, that may not be as important because you can kind of fix things on top. But the nature of watercolors is that you pretty much got to plan it out very well before you paint. So I have my stretcher board and I have it set up here on an easel. I don't paint on an easel, but when I'm sketching out a scene, I will use the easel, and I'll show you why I do that. So we've selected our scene. This is a photo that we took when we were berry picking. This was taken from my phone, and it's just some berries on the bog, on the moss there. And so what I want to do is take this photo and sketch out a scene based on the photo on my stretched watercolor paper. So how do I do that? Well, I've been painting now for over 40 years, and I've learned some really good tips on sketching things out so that you keep perspective and things just look like they're in place. So if you look at the photograph, you'll notice that there are some really neat points of reference on this photo, and you'll find this on every photo basically. So you can see this log here, where the log ends on the scene. You notice these little points here. These are great reference points when you're sketching out the scene. So we got two over here, and here where the logs end. And in the scene itself, you'll notice that you have this little twig here. That makes a really good reference point. And a twig here, and we have some berries. So we're going to use these reference points to kind of plot out our scene on the stretched paper. So here's how I do it. You'll notice that I got this set up on an easel, and I have my photograph with me. And the trick that I used over the years to get the scene really sketched out nicely is I just use, just eyeball it basically. What I do is I close one eye and I move the photo to a point where, from my perspective now, this photo is covering the complete area of the paper behind it. And so what I do is I get it all lined up, and then I pick one of those reference points we had talked about, and I will note where it is, and then I will go in and I will do a little check mark on the side of the painting. And then I will do that for the next one, and also on the other side I will do that. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up the reference points that we'll use later for sketching out our scene. So, and I will do this horizontally, and I will also do it vertically. So remember the berry we had talked about on the scene. So what I will do is I will find the berry, and I will figure out where it is on a vertical perspective or a vertical axis. And then I will also note where it is on a horizontal axis. So now when I'm ready to find where that berry belongs on the scene, I will just use a ruler and I will figure out where the berry is right on the scene. So I will do this for the entire scene, get it all sketched out. I will do the reference points first, and then I will sketch out the main sections of the painting, put in those little twigs and so on. And then I will start sketching into detail. And these reference points and what I sketch first of all from the reference points will work really well in lining everything up nicely. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my stretched piece of paper over to my working surface, and then I will start sketching it out. I'm going to be a while, so I'm not going to lead you through the entire process, but I will set up and I'll show you how I'm going to do it. So here we are at the working surface. I paint on a drafting table, and the reason I use a drafting table, it's really comfortable. I can change the angle of the paper, the surface, depending on what I'm doing. If I'm doing a wash, I'll have a steeper angle, or if I'm doing detailed, I'll probably paint more flat down. The reason I like the drafting table, especially this one, is that I've modified it so that I can stand up or sit down to it. I've put extensions on the legs, and this is important when I'm painting for long periods of time. If I was sitting for maybe more than 2 or 3 hours, I'm sure my back would be quite painful. So by standing up and sitting down is a lot easier on the body when I'm painting. I've actually painted for about 6 hours straight before. So here we are, we have our scene all plotted out. Now I'm not sure if you can pick it up on the camera, but probably some of these you can see. I've put little check marks along the perimeter of the scene as I got it all plotted out. And you'll notice that maybe also if you can see it, I'm not sure, but there's a B here, and there's a B over here, and other notations made around the perimeter. And the reason I've done this is I know that this check mark here, B, is where we plotted out that berry that we had talked about earlier. And I have a few more berries plotted out. And you'll notice that the check marks here, and those two that we had talked about earlier are the logs in the scene. So I'll use these as reference points. So I have my photo here, which I will be painting from. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll sketch out the log in the foreground, and then this big log, which, no clear lines, but it looks quite nice. We'll sketch that one out, and then we'll start filling in the other things. So first thing I will do is sketch out this log, and I've done a couple lines along here, so I'll just carry on with lines. And when you're stretching for a watercolor painting, you don't want really heavy lines. You want just enough to be able to see it without actually showing up in the watercolor painting. So I've done this line here now, and for this line up here, you'll notice that in the scene, there's, I'll just show it to you here, there's a little bit of a raised area in the log here, right there. So I'm going to sketch that in, and so what I'll do is just sketch it in here, like that. And this now, I will use this for reference points for other things. So everything you put in becomes a reference point for something else in the painting. So I have this log sketched out here. And then secondly, I will go up to this log here, and I know from my reference points that the top of the log here would go like over to about here. So I'll just sketch that out, and then along here, that's for a berry, but down here is the rest of this log here. And the log actually comes up at a little bit of an angle, so I can just kind of rough that out. So the first thing I do is kind of rough it out with lines, and then I start carefully putting in the detail. The next thing I would do after the main logs are these twigs. This twig here, it makes a really good reference point. So from here, I've made a couple of check marks on my board based on where this would end, but it doesn't actually go right out of the scene. It ends about here. So what I'll do, I'll come down to about where it is, and I know there's a little cross in the twig here, so I will come down to about here, and I will just sketch the twig like this. And so I will continue this process throughout the entire painting until I get it sketched out. So I will go through, I will sketch it out, and once I get it all sketched out, I will start the video again, and I will point out a few things about how I got it all lined up and so on. So I'll be just sketching for a while.